Welcome to Study Loop.
Here we're looking at the gains that can be had from trade, and our example is giving us England and Scotland and giving us their production possibilities. We're told that in England 50 scones can be produced per hour or one sweater can be produced per hour. And in Scotland they can produce 40 scones per hour or 2 sweaters per hour. So part A here is just asking us to find the absolute and comparative advantages for each one of these, for each item, each commodity. So let's start with the absolute advantage because that one's pretty straightforward. And the absolute advantage really just asks us who is more efficient at producing the goods. So who can produce more goods per hour? So we're taking a look at, let's look at scones. So comparing scones to start for these absolute advantages, we see that England can produce 50 scones per hour and Scotland can only produce 40 scones per hour. So that tells us that England has this absolute advantage in producing scones just simply because they can produce more in a shorter amount of time. Now, if we're looking at sweaters, what it looks like is that England can produce 1 sweater per hour, but Scotland can produce 2 sweaters per hour. So Scotland is better at making sweaters than England. So we can say that Scotland has this absolute advantage in producing sweaters. Now the comparative advantages, and this is where it gets a little bit more difficult because we need to calculate opportunity costs. So if we wanted to calculate the opportunity costs for each of these, let's start with England and find what their opportunity cost of 1 sweater is. So it tells us that in 1 hour, they can make 1 sweater. So in that same hour that is spent making that sweater, how many scones could have been made? Well, it looks like they can make 50 scones per hour. So that tells us that they could produce, or that their opportunity cost of 1 sweater is 50 scones. Now, if we wanted to look at Scotland, we've got England right here. This is their opportunity cost of producing a sweater, is 50 scones. Now, Scotland's opportunity cost of producing a sweater is a little trickier because it tells us that they can produce 2 sweaters per hour, whereas England was really straightforward, it's just 1 sweater per hour. But these 2 sweaters per hour tells us that it takes them 30 minutes to make each sweater. So in those 30 minutes, how many scones could they have made? Well, 30 minutes is half of an hour. So those 40 scones that they can make in 1 hour needs to be divided in half. So we could also look at this as in these 40 scones that they can make per hour divided by those 2 sweaters they can make in an hour gives us the opportunity cost of 20 scones. So this says England's opportunity cost of 1 sweater is 50 scones. Scotland's opportunity cost of 1 sweater is 20 scones. So this allows us to identify these comparative advantages. So if we wanted the comparative advantage in scones, let's see, scones and sweaters. So we just calculated the opportunity cost for sweaters only. So who has the lowest one? Well, it looks like Scotland has the lower opportunity cost of producing sweaters. That means that they have this comparative advantage in sweaters. So we can say that Scotland's got the sweater comparative advantage. And now for scones, if we wanted, we could recalculate opportunity costs, or we can just understand that the same country is not going to have a comparative advantage in both goods, meaning that inherently England must have the comparative advantage in producing scones. So we can save ourselves some time on calculations by just understanding that that England would have that comparative advantage. So now that we've identified our absolute comparative advantages, we can ask ourselves, which commodity will Scotland export? Well, we know that countries export and produce the good with which they have the comparative advantage in. So because Scotland has the comparative advantage in sweaters, we can say that Scotland will export sweaters. All right, now part C is asking us, what if Scotland could only produce 1 sweater per hour? So initially they could produce 2 sweaters per hour, but now they can only do 1. We want to know if Scotland could still gain from trade with England if they could only produce this 1 sweater per hour. So we may want to recalculate our comparative advantages. We can leave England's alone, where we found that they have a comparative advantage of a sweater equal to 50 scones. But now let's redo this for Scotland. And let's see, so they can still produce those 40 scones per hour. But now they can only produce that one sweater as compared to the 2 that they could do before. So this is giving us now an opportunity cost for Scotland of producing sweaters equal to 40 scones. And looking at this, now we can compare these opportunity costs again. Scotland now has this opportunity cost of 40 scones, which is still less than England's opportunity cost up here of 50 scones. So the answer to this question would be yes. Scotland could still gain from trade because they still have that comparative advantage.